The old draft horse stopped mid-field, refusing the line the farmer had drawn, its hooves pressing into a curve the land itself seemed to remember. In the dry wind of a failing ranch, that quiet resistance was not weakness. It was the first sign that something long forgotten was still alive beneath the surface. By the time Daniel Carter stepped into the auction yard, the morning had already lost its warmth. Dust hung low in the air, drifting between the wooden rails as if even the wind had grown tired of crossing this place. Trucks idled along the fence line, engines humming in uneven rhythm. Men stood with their hands in their pockets, speaking in quiet, practical tones, voices that weighed animals the way they weighed lumber or scrap metal. Daniel kept his hat low, not out of habit, but to avoid meeting anyone's eyes. 3 seasons had taken nearly everything from him. The first drought had been dismissed as bad luck, the second, a warning. By the third, the land no longer responded the way it used to. The soil broke apart too easily. The water didn't stay. The pasture turned thin and uneven, as if something beneath it had shifted beyond repair. He had come here not looking for hope, only for time. A few more weeks. Maybe a season, if he stretched it. The auction moved quickly. Younger horses stepped forward with alert eyes and clean coats, their muscles still holding promise. Bids rose and fell with predictable confidence. Daniel didn't lift his hand once. He knew what he could afford, and it wasn't any of them. Then, almost as an afterthought, they brought out the draft horse. It didn't enter the ring so much as arrive into it, each step deliberate, unhurried. Its shoulders were broad but worn, the weight of years settled deep into its frame. The coat had dulled, not from neglect, but from use. Long seasons of pulling, standing, enduring. One ear tilted slightly off-center, an old imperfection no one bothered to explain. No one stepped closer. A man near the rail gave a short laugh. "Too old to work," he muttered. "Won't pull like it used to." Another voice added, "Costs more to feed than it's worth." The words landed flat, like they'd been said too many times before. Daniel watched the horse, not with interest, but with a kind of quiet recognition. There was no fire in it, no sharp alertness like the younger ones. But there was something else, something steadier. It didn't shift its weight nervously. It didn't search the crowd. It simply stood. The auctioneer's voice moved faster now, as if trying to outrun the silence. The opening number dropped lower than usual. No hands rose. Daniel felt the weight of his own hesitation press in, not from doubt, but from knowing exactly what this meant. This wasn't a solution. It wasn't even a gamble. It was a decision made when no other paths remained. His hand lifted, almost without him noticing. The sale ended before it could gather any attention. No one questioned it. No one needed to. The horse was led away with the same calm it had carried into the ring. Daniel signed the paper with fingers that felt heavier than they should have. The ink dried quickly in the dry air, leaving behind something final, something quiet. By late afternoon, the trailer rolled through the open stretch of land toward his ranch. The horizon widened as the road flattened, the sky stretching out in pale blue above fields that no longer held the color they once did. Fences leaned where they had been repaired too many times. The windmill turned slowly, its rhythm uneven, as if unsure whether to keep going. When Daniel opened the trailer gate, the horse didn't rush out. It stepped down carefully, placing each hoof as though testing the ground, not out of fear, but out of habit. It paused once its weight settled onto the earth, lifting its head just enough to take in the space around it. The ranch did not welcome it. It simply received it. Daniel closed the gate behind him and stood for a moment, unsure of what he expected to feel. Relief didn't come. Neither did regret. Only a kind of quiet acceptance, like the last page of something already decided. He reached for the lead rope, guiding the horse toward the barn. Up close, the animal's breathing was slow, steady. Its presence filled the space in a way that felt older than the structures around it. Not stronger, not better, just older. "Barrow," Daniel said after a moment, the name coming without thought. The horse didn't react. Inside the barn, the air held the scent of wood, dust, and time. Harnesses hung where they had been, left seasons ago. Tools leaned against the walls, waiting for work that had grown uncertain. Daniel tied the rope loosely and stepped back. For the first time that day, he allowed himself to look directly at the animal he had just bought, not as a tool, not as a solution, but as something he did not yet understand. Outside, the wind shifted, carrying across the fields in a long, low sweep. Daniel turned his gaze toward the land, toward the lines he would have to cut again in the morning, toward the soil that no longer held the same promise. He exhaled slowly. Tomorrow, he would put the horse to work. And if it couldn't do what was needed, then there would be nothing left to try. Behind him, Barrow stood in stillness, the fading light tracing the shape of its worn frame against the barn wall. It did not move, but something in the quiet felt unfinished. The morning came without ceremony. A thin gray light stretched across the fields, flattening everything into the same quiet tone. Daniel was already awake before the sun had fully risen, moving through the motions he had repeated for years. Boots on, coffee left half-finished, the barn door opening with a low, familiar creak. Barrow stood where he had been left, calm, unbothered by the cold. For a moment, Daniel simply watched him, not long enough to form a thought, just long enough to feel the weight of what needed to be done. Then he reached for the harness. The leather had stiffened from disuse, its surface marked by small cracks that told their own history. As he worked it over the horse's back, Barrow did not resist. There was no tension in the animal's posture, no sign of stubbornness or fatigue. If anything, there was a quiet readiness, subtle, almost easy to miss. That, more than anything, unsettled Daniel. By the time they reached the field, the wind had begun to move again, brushing low across the dry grass. The land stretched out ahead in long, open lines, the same land Daniel had worked in straight passes, season after season, cutting rows that ran clean from one end to the other. He set the line in his mind before he gave the signal. "Easy," he said, low and steady. Barrow stepped forward. At first, everything seemed normal. The harness tightened, the weight shifted, and the soil gave way beneath the first pass of the tool. The rhythm began to settle. Hoof, pull, breath, repeat. Then, without warning, the line broke. Not sharply, not in defiance. The horse simply drifted, a few steps off, then more, a subtle curve forming where there should have been none. Daniel tightened his grip. "Straight," he said, firmer now. Barrow corrected for a moment, returning to the intended path, but the movement lacked conviction. Within seconds, the same slow deviation returned, pulling the line away from the direction Daniel had set. He stopped them both. The silence that followed wasn't loud, but it carried weight. Daniel stepped forward, adjusting the harness, checking the straps, running his hand along the traces as if something mechanical might explain it. Everything was in place. Nothing was loose. Nothing was broken. He stepped back again. "Try it again," he murmured, more to himself than to the horse. They moved forward, and again the same thing happened. The line held for a moment, then bent. Not randomly, never randomly. Always with the same quiet insistence, always pulling toward a curve that didn't belong. By mid-morning, the field no longer looked like a field. It looked uncertain. The straight rows Daniel had planned were interrupted by shallow arcs, lines that seemed to echo something older beneath the surface. From a distance, it might have looked careless. Up close, it felt deliberate in a way that made no sense. Frustration came slowly, building not from anger, but from the absence of explanation. Daniel wiped his hand across his face, leaving a faint streak of dust along his cheek. He looked out over the uneven work, then back at the horse. Barrow stood quietly, breathing steady, as if nothing unusual had happened. "You don't get to choose," Daniel said, his voice low but edged now. "That's not how this works." He set them forward again, firmer this time. The response was immediate, not resistance, not refusal, but a kind of quiet compromise. The horse followed the straight line for longer than before, holding it with visible effort. Then, as if reaching a boundary only it could feel, it slowed. Its head lowered slightly, its pace shifted, and the line bent again, not sharply, not dramatically, just enough to change everything. Daniel stopped once more, this time not moving right away. The wind moved through the field, lifting small threads of dry grass into motion. Somewhere in the distance, a loose piece of metal tapped softly against a post, repeating at uneven intervals. He turned slowly, looking back across the field. The curves were clearer now. Not mistakes. Patterns. Faint, but consistent. Each one aligning with something subtle in the land's shape. A dip here, a rise there. Places where the soil felt just slightly different underfoot, though he had never paid them much attention before. He took a step forward, leaving the horse where it stood, and walked along one of the lines. The ground beneath his boots changed almost imperceptibly. Firmer in some places, softer in others. A slight hold of moisture where everything else had been dry. He crouched, pressing his fingers into the soil. It wasn't much, but it wasn't nothing. Behind him, Barrow shifted its weight, the faint sound of movement carrying across the stillness. Daniel didn't turn right away. He stayed where he was, hand resting against the ground, eyes tracing the path that the horse had chosen. Again and again, without hesitation, without variation. Not random, never random. He stood slowly, brushing the dirt from his hand, and looked out across the rest of the field. If it had been once, he could have dismissed it. If it had been uneven, he could have corrected it. But this was something else. He walked back toward the horse, slower now. Not with anger, not with certainty, but with a question he hadn't expected to ask. "What are you seeing?" he said quietly, almost under his breath. Barrow didn't answer. Barrow didn't. It simply stood there, as it always had, steady, quiet, carrying something that did not need to be explained to exist. The wind moved again, stronger this time, sweeping across the field in a long, low current. The dry grass bent with it, revealing, just for a moment, the faint shape of lines beneath. Lines that had always been there. Lines he had never followed. Daniel exhaled slowly, his gaze fixed on the land in a way it hadn't been in years. Something had shifted. Not in the soil, not in the horse, but in the way he was beginning to look at both. He reached for the reins again, but this time his grip was different, looser, less certain, as if forcing the line forward no longer felt like the only way through. "All right," he said, almost reluctantly. "One more pass." The horse stepped forward, and this time Daniel didn't pull it back immediately. He did not correct the line. That was the first change. It felt wrong at first, like letting go of something that had always held the field together. For years, Daniel had measured his work by straightness, by how cleanly a row cut across the land. Order had meant control. Control had meant survival. Now he walked behind the horse without forcing it back. Barrow moved with the same steady pace, its hooves pressing into the earth in a rhythm that seemed older than the field itself. The curve returned, gentle but certain, tracing a path Daniel had never chosen before. He followed. The tool dragged lightly behind, turning the soil just enough to reveal a difference. Not in color, not at first, but in weight. The ground resisted in some places, gave way in others. A subtle shift that passed unnoticed if you moved too quickly. Daniel slowed. That was the second change. By midday, the field no longer resembled anything he would have called finished work. The lines bent and layered over one another in long, quiet arcs. From where he stood, they seemed almost accidental. But they weren't. He walked the edge of one of the curves again, this time not as a correction, but as an observer. The wind had settled into a steady flow, brushing across the land from the west. As it moved, the grass leaned with it, revealing faint ridges beneath the surface, low, uneven rises that only became visible when the light struck them just right. Daniel narrowed his eyes. He had seen this before. Not recently, not in years, but somewhere in memory, buried beneath routine and repetition, there was a shape that matched what he was seeing now. He left the horse where it stood and crossed toward the barn. Inside, the air was cooler, shadowed. Dust hung in quiet layers along the beams. The place had not changed much over time, but it had grown still, like something waiting without expectation. Daniel moved toward the far wall, where older things had been set aside rather than thrown away. Boxes stacked without order. Tools that no longer fit the way he worked. He found the ledger where he thought it might be, not because he had been looking for it, but because something about the field had reminded him it existed. The cover was worn, edges softened from years of handling. He opened it slowly, flipping past pages filled with numbers, notes, and rough sketches that had once made perfect sense. Further in, the writing changed. Less about yield, more about land. Small drawings lined the margins. Curved lines, layered across simple outlines of fields. Not measurements, not boundaries. Guides. Daniel ran his thumb along one of the pages, tracing the arc without thinking. Contour. He hadn't used that word in a long time. He stepped back outside, the light forcing his eyes to adjust. The field stretched before him again, but now it looked different. Not new, recognized. Barrow stood where he had left it, unmoving, the harness resting against its shoulders. It didn't turn as Daniel approached. It didn't need to. Daniel walked past the horse and into the field, holding the ledger loosely at his side. He compared what was drawn on the page with what lay in front of him. The curves didn't match perfectly. They wouldn't. Time had softened the land, changed its edges, worn down its sharper lines. But the structure was there. The field had not always been worked in straight passes. It had once been shaped to follow the land, to slow water, to hold it, to guide it where it needed to go instead of letting it run off and disappear. Daniel crouched again, pressing his hand into the soil along one of the curved lines. It held, not wet, not rich, but holding. He moved a few feet away, toward one of his old straight cuts. The difference was immediate. The soil there broke apart easily, dry and loose, unable to keep what little moisture it received. He sat back on his heels, looking between the two. For a long moment he said nothing. The wind passed over the field again, stronger now, lifting the edges of his coat. It moved through the grass, through the shallow lines the horse had made, through the faint ridges that had always been there, but never followed. Daniel stood slowly. His eyes moved across the land, not searching anymore, but measuring in a different way, not how much he could take from it, but how it had once been asked to work. Behind him, Barrow shifted, a small movement that carried across the quiet. Daniel turned. The horse stood as it had all day, steady, unchanged. It had not pointed, not pulled him toward anything hidden. It had simply done the work the only way it knew how. And in doing so, it had shown him something he had stopped seeing. Daniel walked back, stopping a few feet from the animal. "You didn't forget," he said quietly. It wasn't a question. The horse lowered its head slightly, the motion slow, unremarkable. Daniel looked out at the field once more, the ledger still in his hand. 3 seasons of loss had led him here, through drought, through failure, through decisions made too quickly to question. And all this time, the land had not changed nearly as much as he had believed. He had. He closed the ledger gently, holding it at his side. The next step was not in the pages. It was in the work. Daniel reached for the reins again, but this time he did not set a line. He waited. Barrow stepped forward. The curve began almost immediately, subtle as before, pressing into the shape of the land. Daniel followed, not correcting, not forcing, only watching. The field stretched ahead, no longer empty, no longer silent in the same way. It held something now. Not a promise. Not yet. But a direction. And for the first time in a long while, that was enough. By the next morning, Daniel did not reach for the straight line. He stood at the edge of the field longer than usual, the ledger resting unopened on a post beside him. The sky was clearer than it had been in days, a pale stretch of blue that made the land feel wider, more exposed. Nothing had changed overnight, and yet something had. Barrow waited where the harness lay draped across the rail, its presence quiet, unassuming. There was no urgency in the animal, no sense that anything needed to be proven. It simply stood, as if the work would begin when it was ready, not when it was forced. Daniel lifted the harness and set it in the place with slower hands. There was no tension this time, no effort to prepare for resistance. When they stepped into the field, the air carried a faint trace of moisture left behind from a light rain in the early hours. Not enough to soak the ground, but enough to settle the dust, enough to reveal how the land responded when it wasn't stripped bare. Daniel noticed it immediately. The scent, the weight, the way the soil held together under his boots. He said nothing. Barrow stepped forward, and Daniel let the movement unfold without interference. The first curve came naturally, as it had the day before, but this time Daniel didn't wait to see if it would hold. He followed it. That was the third change. The rhythm shifted in small ways at first. Daniel adjusted his stride, no longer bracing against the pull, no longer preparing to correct. His body moved with the motion instead of against it, learning the pattern as it revealed itself. The work slowed, but it also deepened. Each pass carved a shallow line into the field, not cutting through it, but shaping it. The curves began to connect, forming long, quiet arcs that traced the natural rise and fall of the land. Daniel began to see where they were leading, not toward a point, but along a system. He paused at one of the lower edges, where the ground dipped slightly. Water had gathered there from the early rain, not pooling heavily, but lingering, held in place by the subtle shape of the soil. He crouched, pressing his hand against it. The earth gave back. Not dry, not brittle. Alive in a way it hadn't been weeks before. Daniel stood slowly, his eyes moving across the rest of the field. He could see it now. The difference between what he had forced into it and what had once worked with it. Straight lines had drained the land. These curves held it together. He turned back to Barrow. The horse had stopped without command, waiting, not for instruction but for alignment. Its breathing remained steady, its posture unchanged. There was no sign that it understood anything beyond the work itself, and yet it carried that work with certainty. Daniel stepped forward again, setting his pace beside it. They moved together. Hours passed without the same weight they had carried before. The labor was still there, the pull of the harness, the resistance of the ground, but it no longer felt like a struggle against failure. It felt directional, not easy, but guided. By midday, the field had begun to transform in ways that weren't immediately visible unless you stood still long enough to notice. The wind crossed it differently. Instead of rushing straight through, it slowed, bending along the lines that had been carved. The grass followed those paths, shifting in soft waves that revealed the structure beneath. Daniel stopped at the far edge, turning back to look. What he saw was not a finished field. It was a beginning. He removed his hat, running a hand through his hair, his gaze lingering on the patterns they had built. Not perfect, not precise by old standards, but consistent in a way that mattered more now. Behind him, the sound of an engine carried faintly across the distance. A truck. Daniel didn't turn right away. He knew who it would be. The man had come twice already, offering to buy the land before the next season failed completely. There had been numbers involved, practical ones, enough to walk away with something, enough to stop losing. The engine grew louder, then slowed as it reached the edge of the property. Daniel let the sound settle into the background before he finally turned. The truck idled near the fence, dust rising lightly around its tires. The man stepped out, glancing across the field with the same measured look he always carried, assessing, calculating. He raised a hand in greeting. Daniel didn't respond immediately. He looked back once more at the field, at the curves, at the subtle changes that had already begun to take hold. Then he walked toward the fence. The conversation was short. It didn't need to be long. The offer was still there. The reasoning hadn't changed, but something in Daniel had. "I'm not selling," he said, his voice even, without hesitation. The man studied him for a moment, as if weighing whether the answer would hold. Then he nodded once, returned to the truck, and drove off without argument. The dust settled slowly behind him, leaving the field quiet again. Daniel stood there for a moment longer, watching the space where the truck had been. Then he turned back, and Barrow had not moved far. It stood within the field, harness still in place, waiting in that same steady way it always had. Daniel walked toward it, slower now. Not out of uncertainty, but because there was no longer a need to rush. He stopped beside the horse, resting his hand lightly against its shoulder. The warmth beneath the worn coat was steady, grounded. For a moment, neither of them moved. The wind crossed the land again, softer now, carrying with it the faint sound of grass shifting along the curves they had made. Daniel looked out across the field, not as something to fix, not as something already lost, but as something that could still be worked with, if he allowed it to be what it was. He exhaled quietly. "There's more to this," he said, almost to himself. Not doubt, recognition. The patterns they had followed were only part of it. The land was responding, but slowly. And if it was going to hold, if it was going to last, he would have to change more than just the way he worked the field. Behind him, the barn stood in stillness, holding tools that no longer matched what he was beginning to understand. Ahead of him, the field stretched outward, no longer empty, not yet restored, but no longer failing in the same way. Daniel reached for the reins again, his grip steady, measured. "Let's keep going," he said. Barrow stepped forward. And this time the path ahead did not feel like something he needed to control. It felt like something he was only just beginning to learn. The change did not arrive all at once. It came in small, quiet ways, easy to overlook if Daniel had still been measuring the land by the old standards. There was no sudden green across the field, no dramatic shift that could be pointed to and named. But over the following weeks, something held. After a light rain, the water did not disappear as quickly. It settled along the curves, moving slower, spreading instead of running off. The soil beneath Daniel's boots carried a different weight, still dry at the surface in places, but no longer hollow underneath. He noticed it without announcing it. The work continued. Each day followed the same rhythm: harness, field, movement. Barrow did not change the way it walked. It did not adjust its pace to match Daniel's expectations, nor did it respond to the small variations in weather or time of day. It remained steady, consistent, carrying forward the same pattern it always had. The difference was in how Daniel moved within that pattern. He no longer walked behind the horse, as someone trying to direct it. He walked as someone learning where it was going. The lines across the field grew more defined, not sharper, but more coherent. They began to connect in ways that guided the land itself. Grass returned first in narrow strips, then widened slowly. Areas that had once remained brittle began to soften, holding what little moisture came through. It was not enough to call success, but it was enough to continue. One afternoon, Daniel left the field earlier than usual. The sky had shifted into a soft overcast. The light diffused across the land in a way that flattened distance. He walked toward the house, not out of fatigue, but with a thought that had been forming quietly over the past few days. Inside, the air was still. The table held the same papers it always had: numbers, projections, reminders of what the land had not been able to produce. Daniel moved them aside. He pulled a blank sheet forward and sat down, resting his hands on the surface for a moment before beginning to write. Not calculations, not debts, something else. When he stepped back outside, the field stretched out before him in long, quiet motion. The wind moved across it differently now, slower, following the shape of the land instead of cutting across it. Barrow stood near the edge, the harness removed, its head lowered slightly as it rested. Daniel walked toward it, the paper still in his hand. He didn't speak right away. He simply stood there, looking out across what had begun to take form, not just in the soil, but in the way the land held itself together. After a moment, he folded the paper once and slipped it into his pocket. Over the next week, the first visitors arrived. Not many, just a few at first. Neighbors, a couple from town, someone who had heard that Daniel was working his land differently now. They came without expectation, standing at the edge of the field, watching as the lines revealed themselves slowly under the shifting light. Daniel didn't explain everything. He showed them. He walked the curves with them, pointed out where the ground held, where it changed. He spoke less about what had gone wrong, and more about what had once been done differently. Some listened, some didn't. It didn't matter. The work was no longer something he was trying to prove. It was something he was maintaining. Barrow no longer pulled the harness every day. There were longer periods of rest now. The horse moved less, standing in the pasture where the grass had begun to return in thicker patches. Its frame remained worn, its movement measured, but there was a steadiness in it that had not faded. Daniel checked on it each morning, not out of necessity, but as part of the same rhythm that had formed between them. There was no moment where that rhythm was defined. No single act that marked its beginning. It had simply settled into place. One evening, as the light lowered across the field, Daniel stood at the edge of the pasture, watching the way the grass bent under the wind. The lines they had followed were no longer only in the soil. They were visible in the movement itself, subtle but present. Barrow stood a short distance away, facing the same direction. Daniel stepped closer, resting his hand lightly against the horse's shoulder. The warmth beneath its coat was familiar now, not something new, not something remarkable, just present. He looked out across the land again. Months ago, he had believed the farm was ending, that there was nothing left to pull from it, nothing left to change. He had been ready to leave it behind. Now, standing in the same place, the land had not become something entirely different. It had become something remembered. The secret he had been led to was not hidden. It had never been buried beneath the ground or locked away in something waiting to be found. It had been there the entire time, held in the shape of the land, in the way it responded, in the patterns that had once guided it, and in the quiet persistence of a horse that had never stopped working that way. Daniel exhaled slowly, his gaze steady. "You kept it," he said, his voice low, not to the horse alone, to the land, to the memory that had carried through when everything else had been set aside. Barrow did not move. The wind passed over them both, carrying the sound of grass shifting in long, soft lines across the field. There was no final moment to mark what had changed. No clear point where one life ended and another began. Only the work continuing, and the understanding that some things are not lost when they are forgotten, only waiting to be followed again. Sometimes what we call useless is simply something we no longer understand. The land did not fail, and neither did the horse. The way of listening did. If this story stayed with you, there are more journeys like this ahead, where quiet truths reshape the lives we thought were already decided.
If this story meant something to you, share your thoughts below and subscribe to Horse Heart Healing for more.